Today, we will explore one of the most extraordinary and little-known chapters of medieval justice. Trials by ordeal, rituals in which men and women put their bodies to the test before fire, boiling water and combat, in the belief that God would reveal the truth where men could not reach it. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. In the mid-9th century, in the heart of Europe, the kingdom of Lotharingia was ruled by a young king named Lothair II. Like many monarchs of his time, Lothair carried the responsibility of ensuring the continuity of his lineage, an issue that went far beyond the family sphere and touched the very stability of the kingdom, and it was exactly at this point that his life began to complicate in an irreversible way. Lothair was married to a noblewoman named Teutberga, but the union produced no children. In a society where fertility was seen as a divine blessing, the absence of an heir put the future of the entire kingdom at risk. Lothair maintained a relationship with another woman, a mistress named Waldrada, and desired to marry her. To do this, he needed to get rid of Teutberga. In the early Middle Ages, so-called serial monogamy, the practice of a nobleman divorcing one wife to marry another, was not exactly rare. However, Lothair's case took a different turn. Teutberga's brother, Hucbert, vehemently opposed the divorce, and the church also took a stand against it. What could have been a matter resolved in a few months turned into a long judicial process unprecedented in medieval Europe. To strengthen his case, Lothair's party accused Teutberga of having committed incest with her brother, which supposedly provoked the wrath of God and punished her with infertility. It was a devastating accusation, but there was a fundamental obstacle. It was a secret crime, with no witnesses who could confirm or deny the charge. At this moment, the story takes a turn that leads us to the heart of this documentary's theme. Faced with the impossibility of presenting witnesses, Teutberga resorted to something that transcended the justice of men. She appealed directly to God. She offered to submit to a special type of trial, a procedure that the Middle Ages knew very well and accepted as a legitimate instrument for revealing divine truth. And as she was a noblewoman, tradition allowed her to appoint a champion to face the trial in her place. And so it was done. The ritual began with 3 days of fasting and intense prayer. It was necessary for the participants' body and soul to be prepared to receive God's judgment. After this period of spiritual preparation, a large cauldron of water was placed over an open fire and heated until it boiled vigorously. Inside this bubbling water, a small object was placed, perhaps a ring, perhaps a stone. Priests celebrated a solemn mass and blessed the object, asking God to reveal, through it, the truth about the Queen's innocence or guilt. The atmosphere was certainly one of extreme tension. Everyone present knew what would come next. Teutberga's champion then approached the cauldron. Under the watchful eyes of clerics, nobles, and observers from both sides of the dispute, he plunged his arm into the boiling water, reached the bottom of the cauldron, and retrieved the object. The arm was immediately bandaged. No one could touch or examine it before the determined time. 3 full days passed before the bandage was finally removed, and this happened in the carefully controlled presence of a witness from each party and the priest supervising the entire process. The moment of revelation was charged with sacred significance. If the arm was severely burned, if the skin was rotting or showing signs of severe infection, this would be interpreted as a clear sign from God indicating Teutberga's guilt. But that is not what happened. When the bandage was removed, it was found that the arm was healing properly. To medieval eyes, that was unmistakable. God had protected the Queen's champion, preserving his flesh from the extreme damage of the boiling water to reveal Teutberga's innocence to the world. She had been acquitted by divine judgment. This episode is a classic example of an ordeal or trial by ordeal. In Latin, the term was judicium Dei, the judgment of God. In a deeply Christian society where God was accepted as omniscient and supremely just, resorting to divine judgment in difficult cases was not irrationality. It was the most logical thing to do. And in a worldview where God was capable of altering nature in the form of miracles, and where priests invoked such miracles during the Mass in the Eucharist, the idea that God could intervene in a trial to reveal the truth was perfectly coherent. The ordeal we have just described in Teutberger's case was specifically called the ordeal of hot water, or the ordeal of the cauldron. But this was only one of several modalities that existed throughout the Middle Ages. The ordeal of hot water is considered the oldest of the non-combat ordeals and probably originated among the Franks. The first documented mention appears in the first draft of the Salic laws, dated approximately 510, and the procedure only begins to appear in the laws of other peoples as Frankish power and influence expanded across Europe. This early date suggests that the practice may have roots in pre-Christian traditions, but practically nothing is known for certain about any similarities or differences between the ordeal prior to 510 and the one we know from later records. The landscape of ordeals transformed significantly with the rise of the Carolingian dynasty to the Frankish throne in the mid-8th century, and developed even more expressively during the 9th century under Charlemagne and his successors. New types of ordeals began to emerge, reflecting both the growing importance of these trials and the creativity, if we can call it that, with which medieval society approached the question of divine justice. One of these innovations was the ordeal of the cross. In this procedure, both parties in the dispute stood facing each other with their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, maintaining this position until one side yielded to exhaustion and let their arms fall. The one who lowered their arms first was considered the loser, and consequently the guilty party, or the one in error. This modality enjoyed some popularity for a time, but was eventually banned relatively early by Emperor Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, who considered the practice a disrespect to the sacred symbol of the cross. Other modalities, however, had a much longer life. One of the most influential and widespread was the ordeal of the hot iron. The procedure was similar in spirit to that of hot water, but the form was different. Instead of plunging a hand into a boiling cauldron, the accused had to firmly hold a glowing iron bar and take 3 steps before dropping it. As in the ordeal of hot water, the hand was then bandaged and examined after a set period. A variation of this procedure was the ordeal of glowing plowshares, which first appears documented in the laws of the Thuringians. In this case, plowshares heated until they were incandescent were placed on the ground, and the accused had to walk over them with bare feet. Another important type was the ordeal of cold water, probably originated under Charlemagne with the support of the papacy. The accused was thrown into a river blessed by a priest. If he sank, he was considered innocent. If he floated, the sacred water was rejecting him, indicating guilt. There is a widespread misconception that innocence was determined by drowning, but this does not correspond to reality. Archbishop Hincmar of Reims clearly notes that a rope should be tied to the accused so that he could be pulled out of the water if he sank. There was also the ordeal of the Eucharist, used mainly in ecclesiastical courts. The accused took an oath of innocence and received communion. It was believed that if he were guilty, he would choke on the host or die within a year. For a devout medieval Christian, receiving the body of Christ while carrying a grave sin could be as terrifying as plunging a hand into boiling water, and the fear was real enough to lead many to confess even before receiving the host. And then there was, possibly the most famous of all, trial by combat. The accuser and the accused faced each other in battle. This modality was quite ancient, and in the early medieval centuries was more widespread than the ordeal of hot water, although it took longer to establish itself in certain regions. The Anglo-Saxons have no mention of trial by combat until after the Norman invasion of 1066. Generally, the parties themselves fought, although it was permitted to appoint a champion in certain circumstances. Very young people, the elderly, the sick, or women. The law of the Thuringians specifies that the ordeal of the plowshares should be used when a woman could not find a champion. Over time, the use of champions became so common that some people made careers as professional combat champions. Traditionally, combat was fought with clubs and shields, but knights began to fight in full armor and even on horseback. In theory, the battle lasted until one party surrendered, but when it involved accusations of treason or high-value theft, the combats could become extremely brutal and deadly. It is important to distinguish that not every medieval duel was an ordeal. There were combats that were simple challenges of honor, where the better warrior won regardless of who was right. But the judicial duel was different. It was expected that God would assist, the warrior representing the righteous side, regardless of skill. Still, everyone tried to obtain the best warrior possible. The multiplication of new types of ordeals around the year 800 is connected to the fact that they began to be used much more frequently. Historian Robert Bartlett calls the period from approximately 800 to 1215 the Age of the Ordeal. Bartlett suggests that the Carolingians, especially Charlemagne, saw themselves as holders of a divinely sustained kingship. God had allowed them to take the throne and, through the Pope, appointed Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. For this divine state to function, laws had to be enforced. The ordeal solved a fundamental problem, situations in which ambiguity prevented the administration of justice. In Bartlett's words, it was an instrument for dealing with situations in which certain knowledge was impossible, but uncertainty was intolerable. This concern with certainty is central to understanding ordeals, because they were not used in all cases, nor in most of them. Medieval justice depended on testimony and solemn oaths, but when it was not possible to gather reliable witnesses or when oaths could not be sustained, determining anything with certainty was impossible. This was an acute problem in the case of secret crimes, poisonings, hidden murders, acts that needed to be punished for their gravity but for which there were rarely witnesses. It was in these cases that ordeals came into play. This logic explains why ordeals were frequently employed in cases of sexual misconduct, such as Teutbergers, and also in trials against heretics from the 11th century onward. These were activities practiced in secret, without witnesses. The ordeal of cold water became the most popular choice in trials against heresy, as there was an urgency to resolve these cases quickly. Unfortunately, this urgency sometimes led to episodes of mob justice, as in Soissons in 1114, where those accused of heresy were lynched by the crowd before any formal trial could be concluded. Ordeals were also used in disputes over land ownership and social status. Two parties claiming the same portion of land could call witnesses and swear oaths, but as a last resort, an ordeal could be held. In these cases, combat was more common, especially among nobles of similar status. Disputes over social status reveal how ordeals could be used as an instrument of abuse. In 12th century France, peasants trying to prove they were free and not serfs were often intimidated into giving up by the threat of an ordeal. An illustrative case involves Albert, who burned down a barn of the monastery of Marmoutier and was reduced to servitude, along with his wife Plectrude. Years later, Plectrude claimed that her son Vitalis was free, as he had been born before those events. The monks demanded that she prove it by submitting to the ordeal of the hot iron. Plectrude initially accepted, but backed down when the glowing bar was placed before her. The oath of a serf was rarely accepted as reliable, and when a peasant tried to prove their status of freedom, they were treated as a serf until proven otherwise, which facilitated abuse. Most of the time, the concept of the ordeal was widely accepted, but specific results were contested. In the case of Soissons in 1114, the mob considered the case closed. The accused had floated, therefore they were heretics. The ecclesiastical authorities disagreed. The church's goal had always been to convert heretics, and besides, the results had not yet been formally interpreted. When someone is thrown into a current of water, the result can be quite ambiguous. There are documented cases in which ordeals were repeated multiple times before a final judgment. Evidence was often subjective. How burned did a hand need to be to indicate guilt? How much did someone need to sink to be declared innocent? Could there be tricks or bribery of the priest? But at the same time, people frequently respected the results, and the right to conduct ordeals was granted only to certain clerics. The procedures were generally performed away from the community involved in the hope of avoiding bias. Trial by combat was less ambiguous, but there was always debate about whether it was truly divine intervention or just strength and skill. The Church was practically unanimous in condemning it from the beginning, but the practice persisted. Of course, there were always voices that fundamentally opposed the concept of the ordeal for various reasons. Even before Teutberger's trial and the defense of the results made by Hinchmar of Reims, Bishop Agobard of Lyons had written his Liber contra Judicium Dei, which, as the name suggests, was a book against ordeals. Agobard criticized them for having no basis in scripture or any other authoritative tradition and for simplifying the unknowable nature of divine judgment. For this reason, he compared them to divination, which was considered by medieval thinkers the epitome of pagan magic and called ordeals a superstitious practice. He also argued that such an easy means of acquiring certainty made the divine promotion of reason and just judges useless, a logical paradox in the medieval Christian mentality. If God had given men the capacity to reason and judge with wisdom, why would he offer a shortcut that made those faculties unnecessary? However, Agobard represented a minority in the 9th century. His voice, however eloquent, failed to alter the course of the judicial practices of his time. But the landscape would change significantly in the following centuries. At the end of the 12th century, the same arguments presented by Agobard were taken up with renewed vigor by figures like Peter the Chanter, a theologian and canonist from Paris who criticized ordeals bluntly. Peter the Chanter was especially vocal about the issue of tempting God. He did not reject the idea that God could perform miracles or intervene in this way. Most people in his time firmly believed in miracles, but he noted that it was truly arrogant for any human being to demand a miracle from God whenever it suited them. The ordeal, from this perspective, was not a humble invocation of divine justice, but a bold presumption that God was obliged to respond on demand. Defenders of the ordeal resorted to the liturgy as an argument. The Eucharist was a regular invocation of divine blessings that produced a recognized miracle. Part of the legitimacy of the ordeal derived from its proximity to the liturgy, and the prayers to bless the cauldron and the iron were similar to those used in the Mass and baptism. But the reforms of the 12th century, by defining the sacraments and canon law more rigorously, created a rift. The Eucharistic miracle had biblical support and was esoteric. The ordeal was an innovation without scriptural basis that trivialized the mysteries of God. This growing hostility of ecclesiastical elites toward ordeals culminated in a decisive moment in history. In 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most important ecumenical councils of the entire Middle Ages. Among the many canons approved by this council was a direct prohibition of clerical participation in ordeals. This was the beginning of the end for trial by ordeal. It is true that canon law was the law of the Church, and it did not automatically make ordeals illegal in secular courts, which was where they mainly took place. But the fundamental dependence on priests for the entire ordeal process to function meant that this prohibition was devastatingly effective. Without a priest's blessing, without liturgical prayers, without the celebration of the Mass that accompanied the ritual, the ordeal lost its legitimacy and its meaning. It was no longer a judicium Dei. It was just torture without a divine purpose. Local church councils across Europe reiterated the canons of the Fourth Lateran Council, and more priests refused to participate in ordeals. Some highly centralized kingdoms with strong papal ties, such as England and Denmark, banned ordeals shortly after 1215. Others took longer. But through a gradual process that spanned the entire 13th century, ordeals were made illegal, or simply became impractical and fell into disuse throughout virtually all of Catholic Europe. The practice persisted in some places in highly local and exceptional cases, something the Church regularly complained about, but overall, the age of the ordeal had come to an end, at least in the Catholic world. There were, however, interesting geographical exceptions. The ordeal was introduced into the Byzantine Empire through the Crusades and reached the Russian principalities. In both cases, the practice lasted longer than in the Catholic West, largely due to the rejection of papal authority in those regions. In the Byzantine case, ordeals persisted until the end of the empire itself. But in those places, they never achieved the same popularity and centrality they had in the Western Catholic world. The other major exception was trial by combat. Because the Church had always opposed it, and because it depended less clearly on a visible miracle, priests were rarely as involved in judicial duels as they were in other forms of ordeal. This meant that judicial combat survived longer. Even outspoken critics of ordeals, such as the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, maintained trial by combat for accusations of treason. Over time, however, these duels also fell into disuse. They were banned in many contexts, and by the end of the Middle Ages had become quite rare. There are records suggesting that the last judicial duel in France occurred in the 1380s, although judicial combats were still held elsewhere until the 15th century. Thus, despite the popularity and centrality of ordeals between the years 800 and 1200, the final centuries of the Middle Ages no longer saw this procedure as a fundamental element in the search for judicial certainty. In its place emerged the inquisitorial process and the use of torture, which were paradoxically seen by the mentality of the time as much more reliable means of obtaining the truth in equally grave and complex cases. The cauldron of boiling water gave way to the interrogation chamber, and the glowing iron bar was replaced by instruments designed not to reveal the divine will, but to break the human will. The history of medieval justice is, ultimately, a story of profound transformations in the relationship between faith, reason, and power. Ordeals arose in a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, where God was seen as an active participant in human affairs, and where certainty could be sought through miracles. Their decline reflects not only changes in legal practices, but a gradual transformation in the very way European society conceived the role of God in the administration of earthly justice. If this journey through the fascinating world of medieval justice has sparked your curiosity, if you felt the heat of that bubbling cauldron and the tension of those 3 days of waiting for divine revelation, then consider subscribing to this channel to follow more narratives like this one. Leave your comment below telling us which type of ordeal impressed you the most, or which aspect of the Middle Ages you would like to explore in future episodes. Like this video so that more people can discover these extraordinary stories that the past has to tell us. Because history is not made only of kings and battles, it is made of boiling cauldrons, bandaged arms, and a faith so deep that men entrusted their fate to the will of God. Until next time.